Hello to all of you. Good morning to those of you who are in Europe, and good evening to those of you in Asia, like us here in Japan. And thank you very much for your interest in this topic. So, my name is Valerie Moschetti, and I am the Sciences Po Japan Alumni Association President. And we are lucky to be four of us from the board, in person or online. So, you already know Ines, and there is also Naomi. Bonjour. And Keiko is online. So just a few words about Sciences Po Alumni Association activities. We are about 100 people here, and we organize networkings with other French grandes écoles or foreign universities that have relationship with Sciences Po. We also organize conferences, and thanks to Keiko, we recently organized a concert in February. So now I will introduce our two moderators, Keiko and Ines. Keiko is a Japanese journalist. She's a TV producer of international affairs. She produced documentaries and news programs on European and Asian topics. She graduated from Yonsei University. She has a master in international studies, and she was an exchange student at Sciences Po. So she knows Sciences Po very well. Ines recently graduated from Sciences Po, and she holds a master in international security in Asia. She has 3 years of experience in Asia, and she's currently learning Chinese in Taiwan. But we are lucky to have her here in Tokyo tonight. So just now a few words about housekeeping. I will post on the chat the questions that we are going to ask the three speakers. Later, if you have a question, please write it in the chat, and we will ask you to ask the question live. Okay? So now I will let the floor to Ines for the introduction of the topic.
Thank you, Valerie. So shifting ties, security challenges, and stability in East Asia, a vast topic. As East Asia is becoming the focus of international politics and security tensions, encompassing the two Koreas, Japan, China, and Taiwan. Tension in the Taiwan Strait are rising. The South China Sea remains a hotspot for territorial disputes, and North Korea's nuclear ambitions continue to threaten stability. The growing US-China strategy rivalry is reshaping alliances, while economic security, cyber warfare, and disinformation are becoming critical concerns. Observers and key stakeholders are closely following the war between Ukraine and Russia, and the recent re-election of President Trump to the White House marks a significant shift in global dynamics. Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan all have security agreements or partnership with the US, but that does not mean their relationships, either with Washington or among themselves, are entirely stable. Beyond military risk, trade dependency, energy security, and supply chain disruptions are reshaping the region's strategic landscape. In this complex environment, cooperation and dialogue are more essential than ever. Today, we bring together experts in the region to provide not only national perspectives, but also a broader regional outlook on security challenges and stability. I encourage you all to engage actively, challenge ideas, and explore solutions. Security in East Asia is not just a regional issue, it has global consequences. With that, let's begin. Thank you. And I will let the floor to Keiko-san, who will introduce also all of your speakers of today.
Yes, thank you very much, Valerie and Ines. Now I would like to introduce our speakers for tonight. And first of all, Dr. Valerie Niquet researcher at the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, specializing in China, Japan, and the Indo-Pacific region. From Korea, Dr. Jung-Hoon Lee, professor and dean of the Graduate School of International Studies at Yonsei University, specializing in international security and in East Asian affairs. And Mr. Simon Menet, researcher at the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, specializing in Chinese security policy and French strategy in the region. Now, Ines-san will ask the first questions to you.
So for the first question, I will ask Dr. Niquet about, from your perspective, your research and your fields, what are the primary security threats facing East Asia today? And how do regional actors, in your case, Japan, but also partly China, perceive and respond to these threats, both at domestic and international level?
Well, this is a very vast question, and the more so because you have threats that have been there for many years now, and you mentioned them in your introduction. You have territorial modification of status quo from China with an increasing assertiveness of the Chinese military in the region, in Taiwan Strait, of course, but also in South and East China Sea. You have an increasing capability on the part of China of achieving some objectives, if not all. And all this has been part of the reflection, strategic reflection, and publications, official publications in Japan, for instance, recently, about China being at the forefront of the perception of the risk of destabilization on threats in the region that Japan is facing. But the problem now, and we all know, and everybody is talking about it, of course, is that it used to be a kind of stability in the relationship with the United States, the main, until now, provider of strategic stability in the region, and especially for Japan and South Korea, the two main principal allies of the US in the region, with a strong cooperation between the three at least in recent months. And also a situation where, despite the constant need for reassurance from the US, this is not new, especially concerning few issues like the Senkaku for Japan, for instance, still Japan-US alliance was considered to be the core of strategic stability in Asia-Pacific. And we see today that all this could be jeopardized, at least in terms of perception, which is maybe as dangerous as a reality of change, after some declarations by President Trump, and the fact that Japan today doesn't know really what will be the level of guarantee that it can expect from the United States in case of crisis in the region, including in the Taiwan Strait. As you know, the most important US bases in the region are in Okinawa, very close to the Taiwan Strait. So Japan would be, of course, willing or not, concerned by any tensions or even war, if that is a possibility between China and Taiwan with across the Taiwan Strait. So this is a very direct threat. For Korea, of course, I will not talk too much about Korea because Professor Lee is here and he can do that much better than I would do. But still, only 1 day or 2 days ago, Korea also launched again missiles, and this is a constant activity of pressure on Korea, but also Japan and US and all countries in the region. And, again, what would the US do in order to really protect the region is a big question mark. That said, if you think in terms of, and I'm not talking about wider or broader threats. I mean, these are basic things that both in Japan and in South Korea are very much discussed. In South Korea, for instance, only a day before, I think, or 2 days ago, the issue of getting a deterrent, even possibly nuclear deterrent, is that discussion is much more real in Korea than it is in Japan, for instance, but it shows that the level of uncertainty in the region is very high. So what everybody thought, like, let us, the US letting go of Europe and Ukraine and trying to make deals in Europe and Ukraine would be more favorable for the security in East Asia. This is one of the analysis that was very often made before. Might be, we may have to reconsider that and looking at a situation where there is no security guarantee in Europe, but neither in Asia, with much more consequences, as you know. It's not only that there is no NATO in Asia, it's also that, for instance, in Europe, you have quite significant military powers like France, even though it's not at all at the level of the United States, but it's not the case in Asia, and particularly for Japan, that has no capacity at all today to defend itself against a real threat coming from China, for instance.
Thank you very much, Professor Niquet. I will give the floor to Professor Lee, also on this question of the primary security threats facing East Asia today, and how also South Korea perceive those threats, both also at a domestic level, but also regarding foreign policy. Professor Lee, we cannot hear you. If you could unmute yourself. Thank you very much.
Okay, sorry about that. So first of all, I'd like to thank the Seongspo, the Japan chapter, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to participate in this very timely Zoom conference to talk about the security challenges in Northeast Asia, in East Asia as a whole. Keiko is our proud alum from Yonsei University. I didn't know she was so active with Seongspo as well. Seongspo, of course, has had and I think still does, an MOU with Yonsei University, which Keiko took advantage of to study in France. And I think that's great that she continues with her affiliation with both institutions. Now, to address your question of, what are the main security challenges, I think it's some of which has been pointed out by Professor Niquet, China, and China's hegemonic ambitions in South China Sea, and in the region as a whole, the US response to China's hegemonic ambitions. North Korea continues to be a huge problem, and I will get into this, but if you'll give me a moment to make some broad observations, I'd like to do that first. I think that we are living, of course, we have to talk about Northeast Asia, regional security, but I think we're living in an era where our international order, as we know, without a doubt, is experiencing a momentous shift, which probably has been triggered by Donald J. Trump's election in the United States. Of course, he won a landslide election, and I think he's regarding this as sort of as a people's mandate to take actions. Maybe things that he wasn't able to do in his first term, he's trying to get it done in the 4 years that he has. He's already implemented nearly like 100 executive orders. Just to give you a context, Biden only had 78 in 4-year term. And of course, we all know that Trump is about America first, and that there is a price to pay for all interactions. So the question is liberal democratic order that we so cherish and we took such a valiant effort, especially after World War II, to build up, is that liberal democratic world order under threat? Well, that's a question that I think we have to grapple with, especially in in the immediate few years, where it seems that, we can see it very clearly with Ukraine, values and ideology seems to take a backseat. It's secondary. And allies like Japan and Korea to the United States are no exception to Trump's new approaches. We're seeing this with Canada and Mexico, the tariffs and so on. And Trump seems to have has a distaste for anyone who's profiting or benefiting from trade with the United States. And if I can just list them, except for China, the list is this: Mexico, Vietnam, Ireland, Germany, then it's Taiwan, Japan, and Korea. So we enjoy trade surpluses with the United States, which basically means that, this is going to come back, that, President Trump is going to address these trade imbalances. The Ukrainian lesson, I think, that we can take is that Trump's interest is, number one, reducing American spending, and number two, trying to somehow goad the allies to self-help, spend more on their defenses instead of the United States putting up for it. And number three, it has to be profitable. Whatever the US does, it has to be to the profit of the United States. So alliances are usually forged when there's a clear and present common enemy or target. But when there is no clear and present common enemy, these alliances can sort of unravel. And that might be what we're seeing with the United States and NATO. You're in some of you in France, you probably have more to say about that, but I think that's the case, at least for now. So we're transitioning, as I said, this international order shift, transitioning from the Cold War to the post-Cold War, and what it seems like an era of great power game is sort of like a return to the old ways of imperialism, the big powers gobbling up the smaller powers. Because imperialism is about profiteering and territorial acquisition. We're seeing this with the United States, Trump talking about Panama, Greenland, Canada. China is talking about Taiwan, South China Sea, disputes with Japan and Korea. Russia with Ukraine, and who knows what will follow. So I think that's, this is a very big thing going on in the international stage that we have to think about and put things into context. Specifically for Korea, the security concerns, I know we'll get back to the discussion, so I'll be very, very quick about this. North Korea, number one. North Korea is headed towards a trajectory where it will have more than 200 nuclear weapons. Who knows, in 5-7 years? That's on par with countries like, I don't know how many nuclear weapons you have in France, but probably about 300. So North Korea will be up there with France and England. Think about that. India and Pakistan. Not only that, they have solid fuel ICBMs. And you might have seen it in the news recently, Kim Jong-un, North Korean leader, standing beside a huge construction of submarine. And that's supposed to be a nuclear-powered submarines with SLBM launching capabilities. How do you think that North Korea is able to do that? Where's the technology coming from? Russia, for all the soldiers that North Korea is sending to the battlefields of Ukraine. So this is a huge problem that we're facing, this armament, continuing expansion of the armament of North Korea. How are we going to deal with that? China, its hegemonic ambitions in South China Sea area. Quite frankly, speaking to the Japanese audience, if we didn't have American military forces in both Korea and Japan, I wouldn't be surprised to see Chinese battleships or aircraft carriers right off the Incheon harbor. Yeah, that's how China is very cavalier in this region. One thing that's holding it back is the United States. So I think the really important question to be raised here is how do we solidify these alliances that we have with the United States to meet these challenges? That's only growing, and it will grow even further in the next couple of years.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee, for your insights about both regional and also South Korean issues and challenges concerning both threats. I will give the floor now to Mr. Simon Menet about also the perspective you can give us about also Chinese perspective related
Taiwanese,
to
yeah.
Taiwan also.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and I probably mentioned more about Taiwan than China or other things because I just came back from Taiwan and we got to meet a lot of people and I think have a bit fresh perspectives on actually the situation, even though it's evolving on a pretty much daily basis. But just before I touch on some of the key points I think are important, it's also important to emphasize that unlike Europe and Middle East, East Asia and Indo-Pacific, or yeah, East Asia as a whole, has remained free of conflict so far in like at least recent years. However, there are a range of threats and challenges that Valerie and Professor Lee have mentioned that are undermining the region's security and stability, and they are raising the risks of economic, political, or military conflict within the next 2 to 5 years. And I'm especially thinking about the Taiwan Strait, but there's not only the Taiwan Strait, and there could be different conflicts in the same time. So I think if we were asked this question about the key primary threats like 3 weeks ago or 2 months ago, we would have answered differently. But I think my answer is as well quite focused on Trump's coercive diplomacy and foreign policy as right now the most important factor that can directly impact US-China relations, of course, the security architecture in the region, and also like deterrence efforts towards China, toward DPRK and other countries. So I think right now about Trump, what is important to say is that we have yet to kind of see really and understand what's going to happen for the Indo-Pacific. We know that the Indo-Pacific and China are the priorities of the Trump administration, but we have yet to really understand what's going to happen because most of the focus so far has been on Europe. So I like some of the signs that will be, I think, key for me to see in the next days or weeks will be, for example, now that they want to withdraw, that they are withdrawing from Ukraine, are they going to put massive resources and military aid toward Taiwan? So that's going to be one thing. Are we going to see a deal with China between Trump and because like there have been some signs, there have been some reports from New York Times, from The Economist, from other sources about like Trump's intent to have a deal with China at some point, and we know his use of tariffs to do so, and also kind of like the softer tone that Trump has employed toward China. So those are kind of some of the things, and also about really the support toward, as my colleague mentioned, towards Japan. There have been mixed signals so far, and toward Taiwan. And I'm going to emphasize very quickly on Taiwan because I think the stakes are really, really high, considering Taiwan's dependency on the US in terms of military, but also political and diplomatic aspects. I think Taiwanese so far have been like kind of trying to maintain a facade of confidence toward the Trump's policy. Even though like there have been mixed signals and you know them, and I'm not gonna like list all of the mixed signals from Trump on Taiwan since pretty much his campaign, but there have been many asking a protection fee on Taiwan, asking like raising the bar for tariffs. There's a threat of 100% tariffs on TSMC. And there have been also, as I mentioned, all the declarations about China, but also the fact that Taiwan is stealing kind of the US semiconductor industry, and that has to change. So far, Taiwanese response has been kind of like confident in a way that they are saying the cooperation with the US in terms of defense is so deep that it cannot really change. And once Trump administration is fully realizing the depth of that cooperation, it's just simply going to continue. And also it's because of the strategic weight of Taiwan, and we can talk about it later. And there's also the aspect of just Taiwan is going to answer the demands of the Trump administration, be it on semiconductors, and we've seen it this week or last week about the $1 billion investment commitment from TSMC in the US. Whether it's feasible or not is another question, but that's a positive development. Then declarations also of President Lai on the kind of like 3% GDP spending on military. That also will be difficult to implement, but we'll see how it's going to happen. And yet there are some Trump admin officials like Elbridge Colby that will probably be the number 2 or number 3 of the Pentagon, who has been very clear that Taiwan has to spend 10% of its GDP on defense. So will it be enough? We're not sure. And then Trump can change also behaviors toward Taiwan. So I think we will see really in the next weeks and months how it's going to play out and really what it's going to be for Taiwan. And another key trend I think that is very important to emphasize, and that is kind of linked also to that room for maneuver for Taiwan, but other countries, is the domestic political instability in Taiwan, in South Korea, and in Japan. And I think for Taiwan specifically, I'll let the other specialists talk about Japan and South Korea. They know much better than me. But Taiwan has been, the legislative yuan, Taiwan's parliament has been much more polarized since the new administration came into power last year. And we already seeing an impact on, for example, defense spendings, some of the defense projects. There have been the freeze on the submarine program, those kind of things. And if Taiwan actually wants to commit further on defense, it has to also go through those political difficulties. And I've discussed with legislators, MPs in Taiwan, and some of them were actually very worried about the political situation in Taiwan, because it has an impact, of course, on defense spendings, but also on unity, on the resilience of the society that is very well needed when you see China's influence operations, gray zone operations. And we can, of course, talk about it later as well on those aspects. Lately, the most salient one was the undersea cables, let's say, situation in the Taiwan Strait. So here it's very interesting because there are like those interconnections of threads between the Baltic Sea, between Taiwan Strait, and there was a statement from Ursula von der Leyen on that specifically. So I think I'll stop here so in a matter of time, but there are many things that we will look at in the next weeks and months also that will be important.
Thank you very much for your perspective, Mr. Simon Menet. I will emphasize for people who are attending too, please feel free to ask your question on the chat. We have a Q&A session after this second question. And please mention your name also so we can call you to ask this question. I will let the floor to my colleague Keiko-san for the next question. Thank you. Keiko-san, you unmute. We cannot hear you. Would you mind unmuting yourself and repeating the question, please?
Okay, I'm sorry.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ines-san. Thank you. And then I will ask the second questions to our guest speakers. And could you try to conclude your answer within 5 minutes if possible? Thank you very much. And then, okay, my question to you is that what are the possible scenarios of the East Asian security landscape in the next decade? And then the second is there room for multilateral corporations to maintain stability in East Asia? Actually, I would like to start with Professor Lee. And then, as you may know, of course, but recently the Trump just the criticized the U.S. and the Japan Security Pact in 60s, and then the United States always protect Japan, but Japan doesn't protect the U.S. And then now even in Japan, even among the Japanese liberals, there are some discussion like Japan should be more independent, and then Japan has to have the bigger, the military power. And then what do you think about this? And then what will be the future in East Asia?
Okay, thank you for that question. It's a big question. It's a very difficult question. There's clearly, I think you're on spot to point out that all countries, NATO countries, Japan, South Korea, we have to do more because especially as President Trump is talking about allies not doing enough, not paying enough. So that could come back to, like, for example, renegotiations of the special measures agreement that we have with the United States, Korea, US. This is the money that we pay to the United States for the stationing of 28,000 American troops in Korea. It was actually the most recent agreement was concluded just before the end of the Biden administration. So there were some people who were saying that maybe we shouldn't do that because if Trump wins and he finds out, he's gonna get angry and he's gonna get, he's gonna ask for renegotiations anyways. So that's certainly a possibility. Now, with I wouldn't say decoupling, but clearly there's some strains and tension between the US and NATO, which may, I think, have a positive effect, if you will, in NATO becoming or cooperating more with countries like Japan and Korea. We've already been annually participating in the NATO summits, our president. So that might become more institutionalized. Now, I would think that if you're asking about multilateral cooperation, we're not going to have like a, Asia UN where China and Japan and Korea and all the countries in Asia will come together and, and cooperate for prosperity. No, I don't think that's in the near future. So the multilateral cooperation you might be talking about is very parochial. So we can talk about multilateral cooperation between the US and its allies in this region. There's already some developments, like for example, that there's Quad, and then there's Squad, a security Quad, which is you exchange India with the Philippines. So it's the US, Australia, Japan, and the Philippines. And it's about deterrence in the sea against China. So this is something that South Korea has expressed interest and can actually jump on board as a multilateral cooperation with the like-minded countries. AUKUS is another area, the Australia, US, and the UK, not the Pillar 1, but Pillar 2, which is about developing a range of advanced capabilities, like sharing technologies and interoperability of the defense system, is certainly something that South Korea or even Japan should be interested. So there's another AUKUS. Pillar 2 is another area where, especially with North Korea, brandishing its nuclear-powered submarines. This is something that we can develop further for multilateral cooperation. Then there are other areas where Japan and South Korea can combine to deal with the United States, help the U.S., and have a mutually beneficial cooperation. One of course is the MRO, the U.S. Navy. U.S. Navy, MRO meaning the maintenance, the repair and the overhaul. This President Trump has actually directly asked President Yoon before the indictment petition that South Korea can actually help out, because South Korea is a global shipbuilding powerhouse, and so is Japan. So I believe that this is something that we can also work in. Another area, multilateral, I'm talking about like US, Japan, South Korea, is the building of nuclear reactors in the United States. US has like 90-some nuclear reactors, which are very old, right? They have to build new ones. Does the United States have the capability to do so? No. South Korea does. Japan does, right? So I think this is another area where Japan and South Korea can combine to help the US build the nuclear reactors to meet the challenges arising in terms of the need for an explosion of energy, electricity, and only nuclear reactors can provide that. So there are niches. There are areas that the three countries, Japan, South Korea, and the United States, can cooperate and establish the foundation within the next 4 years. And I think, and that's in a way, mini multilateralism in the works. And I think it can happen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And then I would like to move to Mr. Menet-san. I will ask you the two same questions, but you were mentioning about the deal between the US and China in the first session, and I'm really interested in what would be the that kind of a possible deal between them. And then could you tell us the future vision of East Asia in terms of the international sector?
Okay. So as Professor Lee mentioned, I think it's an extremely wide question and quite difficult to answer because we don't even have really certainties for the next month. So in the next decade, it can happen so many things, and can happen literally a Taiwan crisis, which we don't know the nature, but I will touch on that. And then it can be like very different security architecture from the one we see now and we know now. Briefly on the deal between China and the US, this was something that was kind of also at play in the first Trump mandate. The question was whether they could be able to have, one economic deal. It's not really about security or anything else, but it's really about having, like for what Trump sees as correcting that unfairness, balance of trade, etc., from China. And we know that Trump is really keen on deals and this kind of like transactional policy. So quickly about the security landscape, how it's going to play out in the next decade or in the next week. I think there will be no Asian NATO for sure, and that we will not see like a robust multilateral security framework within the region. And if you take only Northeast Asia, for Northeast Asia, it will kind of depends on Trump's positioning and posture. Whether it continues to pressure allies like Japan, like Taiwan, like South Korea. We haven't seen anything on South Korea yet, but and the, like the kind of like the perception, as Valerie I think mentioned, about the commitment of the US, whether there's an incident in the South China Sea or whether there's a crisis in the Taiwan Strait. And so far, it's really, really, really mixed signals, as I was mentioning earlier. However, in some of the countries that we know in the region and the security architecture in the region, the US remains very relevant, and this dependency that's still in place in the region. For Taiwan, for example, if the US commitment is not strong anymore, and if the kind of like this defense cooperation is not as it is, there's not much alternative really. And we've seen under President Tsai Ing-wen, there was the new Southbound policy, for example, that was kind of the Taiwan's Indo-Pacific strategy. And aiming at Southeast Asian countries, but also Australia, New Zealand, India, Pakistan. I think Sri Lanka as well was part of them, with the goal of really economic diversification from China and also being able to build kind of some political capital with those countries to improve Taiwan's international standing and improve its diplomacy environment, kind of. We have seen that under President Lai Ching-te, this new Southern policy is not the priority anymore. It's still up here, but there's not much emphasis on the new Southern policy. The emphasis is much more on the US and Japan, and then to some extent on Europe, but not on, for example, Southeast Asian countries, which could initially look a bit more obvious to us. And so it means that kind of like those diversification efforts, even if they work on the economic aspects, they would be much more difficult in the political space. And then like it's about also the international support toward Taiwan. The US was really kind of pushing at the initiative for internationalization of China of Taiwan support. Sorry, but that's will weaken if with kind of Trump's foreign policy and the lack of confidence toward the Trump administration. So that's kind of like about the security landscape and about Chinese leadership also in terms of security. We know, and it's really like now crystal clear about the dependency of Southeast Asian states toward China, especially in terms of economic dependency. If we see a withdrawal of the US in Southeast Asia through USAID, but other also channels, China could fill more the gaps. And it did before with Cambodia, for example, at the beginning of the 2010s. We are already seeing it in some of countries in terms of aid, but it can be more on the security front as well in the future. And then maybe I'll stop here because I think I passed 5 minutes, but I'd be happy to touch on maybe a Taiwan contingency and some other aspects.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And then lastly, I would like to ask Dr. Niquet the 2 questions. And then the landscape in East Asia in the future, and then also multilateral cooperation here in the region, in this region. But especially, I would like to Dr. Niquet about the the cooperation in Asia. And then as you may know, Japanese Prime Minister Ishida is sometimes mentioning about the collective the security alliance in Asia. Actually, this idea is even for the Japanese, this idea is a bit sounds difficult, and then there are a lot of the people who have the skeptical criticism. And then do you think that the East Asia can have the cooperation like NATO? And then also what do you think about the cooperation in Asia? The European case could be the model for the Asian cooperation. What can the East Asia can learn from you?
Well,
Europe.
What can East Asia can learn from us is that it's very important to think about defense issues and stability and what to do with the US before the crisis arises. But I'm not sure that Asia is any more prepared to do that, and especially at the individual states. And I have Japan in mind rather than in Europe. And so I'm not sure we can give any lessons for the time being. Plus, the situation in Asia is extremely different. You mentioned Ishiba-san's talks about an Asian NATO. There are big limitations in terms of multilateral cooperation between, for instance, of course, Japan, Korea, the Philippines and other countries, Vietnam also are facing the same threat in a way. Also in some, up to a certain level, the same interest, but not completely. This is something that we have in Europe too, of course, regarding relations with Russia, for instance. So first to think about what are the interests of these different countries facing China, to have a strategic discussion. And of course, there are already many dialogues. I think it's a very important point, including at the level of experts, to exchange more. And this is all the more important because, as Simon mentioned, you have a lot of projects and in terms of defense spending and including in Taiwan, but Japan is of course talking about it in order to appease as much as they can Trump and to try to give him the certainty that it's good for the US to remain engaged for Taiwan or for Japan or for South Korea. So there are a lot of discussions, but there is a complete lack of consensus at the population level and even at the political parties level, and even inside the LDP himself in Japan about how to do it. What to put in, what does that mean to increase the budget? To do what? I mean, you have no real answers to that. What to do with the money? Buy American so that the US is happy, and for what strategy? How to reorganize, how to be more capable in terms of being in operational reactivities, facing the potential actions by China. All these questions need answering, and for the time being, I don't see that many reflection on that, you know, and it's a little bit the same in Europe. I mean, more money, yes, but to do what? And with what kind of organization? And so this is very important point. On that point has not been solved at all. And we see that in Taiwan, where the change of majority inside the Yuan and Parliament means that opposition is, again, this is not the first time in the history of Taiwan, using the budgetary issues with defense spending in order to go back to the presidency. So all this is extremely complicated to manage, and we have the same also in Japan in a way, despite declarations to the contrary. And as for the future of Asia in 10 years, I might be more optimistic, but not absolutely certain about it. One, elections in the US. In 2 years, you have the midterms. So regarding what is going on now in terms of, you know, financing and so on in the US, some people, there might be a backlash. And unless Donald Trump launches a real coup, meaning cancelling all elections and deciding that he will stay in power like Xi Jinping forever, maybe some Americans, some people in the United States might react to that temptation. But if he accepts the rules of democracy, in 2 years, you have midterm, and we don't know what will happen then. Maybe a change of majority at the Congress, and so it would be a big change. And in 4 years, you have new presidential elections. So I think he will have to be a little bit more careful, maybe, or maybe GD Vance, if he wants to defend his own career in the future, might have some influence. We will see. But this is one point that will have huge influence on the strategic landscape in Asia within 10 years. The second point is, of course, China. Yes, and the fact is that it might be dangerous too, but I don't see China being more provocative in the next few months or years, facing a highly unpredictable Donald Trump. I already see a strategy of being, you know, more open, nicer to the neighbors of, you know, like Wang Yi's speech recently about China is a reasonable one, and it rises an echo in Japan and in, I'm not sure about Taiwan, but in Japan or even South Korea, where people say that, well, China is, we have common interest, I mean, in terms of tariffs and economy and so on. it's the same in Europe. Look at the UK. The UK is much nicer to China these days than it was 1 year ago. So I think China will be on the charm offensive. And it means that maybe there will be no war in East Asia in the near future, but you may have a complete change of, alliance. No, of course not. I mean, I don't see such a switch, but, more rebalancing of the willingness from actors, regional actors, to antagonize China and be more willing to try to find a common language, common interest to face the United States. So
Thank
in
you.
a way, appeasement, if you prefer.
Thank you very much. Ines-san?
Yeah, on this more peaceful word of Dr. Niquet, I would like to call for ask the question, Yuki Kurihara. Would you mind opening your mic and ask the question to the panelists, please?
Yes. Thank you so much for the insightful discussion. I'm Yuki at Sciences Po Alumni and working currently in the International Institute for Strategic Studies, IISS London here. My question is about the security cooperation between Asia and Europe in terms of deterrence. Japan have developed the individual tailored partnership program with NATO and the first ever security defense partnership with the EU last year. I've also reached a very significant milestone, I think, but still just for the sake of friendship and goodwill, given the content of the partnership they signed. But amid the growing, strategic uncertainty in U.S. foreign policy, maybe we have to go beyond the practical cooperation and start discussing what we can actually do together if a contingency in either region happened. For example, the ammunition supply in Indo-Pacific is already hugely affected by the high rate of consumption in Ukraine. So I understand it would be very challenging for individual European countries, even including France, to project physical defense capabilities to the Indo-Pacific region, but specifically, what can Japan and South Korea and Europe do to enhance deterrence synergies between Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific region? Thank you.
I guess if you want Professor Lee to start first to answer this question. Your mic is off. Perfect,
Okay.
yeah.
Yes, Mr. Kurihara, I think that's a very good question. And I think certainly I can only speak for Korea, but Korea is already on the trajectory of greater cooperation with NATO and with European partners as well. I think the thing to look for, the trend in world politics, is that because President Trump is calling for every country to self-help in their defense, that United States is no longer going to be the world police, right? Helping everyone, that everyone has to raise their defense budget, defense spending, and have military capability so that the US burden will be reduced. I think that's where South Korea comes in, because in recent, especially with the Ukrainian war, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, South Korea's defense industry has exploded, quite frankly, with its artillery pieces, the tanks. We're very good at making weapons system, where Europe was not ready. Okay, Europe was not ready for this, but it's very funny that you have the Ukrainian war, which is now 3 years. When Russia invaded and the war erupted, interestingly, the two countries that were prepared and ready to immediately provide weapons or military troops or whatever were South Korea and North Korea, right? Why? Because South Korea and North Korea, you know that we're still in a state of armistice, which means that we're in a state of war. The war has not ended, right? So we've been preparing for war. We've, of course, prepared to deter the other, but we've been preparing for war, which means that we stand ready. And when the war broke out in Ukraine, we were ready to provide some of the weapon systems that NATO needed. Of course, we didn't do it directly, right? Because we have a relationship with Russia as well. And Putin is very sensitive about South Korean lethal weapons being exported to help Ukraine. So we go a indirect way to sell to Poland or the United States and otherwise. So, I mean, I think this is an area, defense industry, which is going to probably quadruple in the next couple of years. And South Korea will be very much at the heart of whatever Europe does, NATO does, in its effort to expand and increase its defense spending.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. I saw Simon Menet is raising his hands. So
yeah, just very briefly, because it's not to reply on the kind of like South Korea, Japan aspects, but it's more on the security developments or deployments from European states to the Indo-Pacific. And I think, Valerie, you can touch on that too, since you were part in it. But I think one of the positive developments we've seen so far, and that also replies to another question I saw in the chat about positive developments in the region, is the fact that the France has deployed its aircraft carrier, and it has been in many of the countries so far, in Indonesia, I think in Singapore. There were exercises with the US and Japan in the Pacific Stellar 2025 exercise, and this with beautiful picture of the three aircraft carrier next to each other. So I think those developments and deployments will continue to occur, and it's very clear from the Ministry of Defense also. They said that they want to put more resources in the defense attaches in the region, so there will be like kind of a reinforcing on that aspect. For sure, resources will be strained because there will be this like a rearm Europe efforts, and I think it's going to be much more tough to have much more like kind of like put more resources in the Indo-Pacific. But there are things happening. I think what will be lacking will be the political attention, especially in Brussels, but also in Paris, where the Indo-Pacific is not currently the priority. And we've seen it in the past year or so. France should have had an update of its Indo-Pacific strategy from both kind of like the Ministry of Armed Forces and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It did not happen. And it's kind of also telling about kind of the political focus. President Macron will be at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore. So that's very, very good, because he hasn't been to Singapore since he's in power. But yet, will it translate really into much more efforts? I'm not sure. But there are still like those commitments since 2019 for France of deploying ships in the region, especially in the Taiwan Strait, for freedom of navigation operations, those kind of things.
Yeah, just one word. Yes, indeed. I actually, France is one of the countries in Europe doing the most in terms of deployment in the region. And the deployment of the aircraft carrier group with an aircraft carrier, but also 3 frigates, 1 submarine, and other ships, and a lot of interaction with regional powers is extremely significant. But it will not happen every year. This is for sure. It costs money. And it brings back to the rising the budget of defense budget. So there are a lot of debates in Europe because at the European level, you know that we have officially a limit on the deficit allowed to each country. France is the double of what is officially allowed. So the issue is, can you put the defense spending out of that limitation, which is very important. The other, when I said just before, to do what, it also, you know, how to develop and protect and defend indigenous defense industry. And this is extremely important. Professor Lee mentioned it for South Korea. South Korea is now even sometimes perceived as a competitor in terms of defense industries by some others, including France in the world. So it's a very, very strong actor, and it's a good thing. For Japan, you see that the difficulty, as with some other countries in Europe, you know, the focus on buying American is not finished yet. And there is not yet really significant defense for many historical reasons. I will not come back to that now, but defense industry in Japan, even if things are changing step by step, but it's extremely low. And the acceptance level of the population is still also very low, which is not the case in France, for instance, where there is a high level of acceptance. Not to raise taxes, but at least to focus on defense, which is very important. So in order, and plus the last point is, yes, mentioning more cooperation, you know, Japan was very eager to also develop its level of cooperation on interaction with NATO. To do what again? For, you know, is it to protect more Japan in Asia Pacific, or what Japan could really do in Europe or Atlantic in order to participate to the defense of that region too? It's a very complicated question. Plus, what about NATO? I mean, everyone is wondering about, well, what will become of NATO. So maybe we should frame it in other, you know, in other, I'm losing my words in English, but anyway, in another way, I mean, to put it simply, you know, the future of NATO is really, you know, many people are asking questions about what will happen to NATO. For instance, if the US completely disengage, what will be the cooperation with other countries? It's complicated. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions and insightful answers. As we are approaching the end of this conference, I will leave the floor to Keiko-san to ask the participants for the summary.
Okay. Until now, we are listening to insightful analysis and a very meaningful discussion, thanks to the three our guest speakers tonight. And at the end of this event, I would like to ask our speakers to have your final and short conclusion, one by one. So first will be Mr. Shimon Menet-san.
I wasn't sure if there were still some questions from the participants. I'm not sure. Is there any, just so we are sure that like maybe no one wanted to desperately ask question?
How about Ines-san? Can you find some?
There is one other question in the chat you touched upon also.
Okay, good.
I think we can wrap it up. Yeah.
Sound good. And yeah, maybe on that question in the chat, it's always interesting to ask about the positive developments, because we tend to always emphasize and focus on the bad parts. But there are some also positive developments on terms of security cooperation, for example, between the Philippines and France, Philippines and Japan, you know, Philippines also interest toward Taiwan, those kind of things. So here there are like some positive aspects. And of course with Taiwan, I mean, like there are many more European states also kind of like looking at Taiwan, trying to deepen cooperation. France is really one of the most active, but there's also Czech Republic that is doing tons of things, and some other countries. So that's positive within some limits, of course. of what we can do and also the reality of Taiwan's dependency toward the US, etc. But quickly, in terms of conclusion, as we mentioned, I think we are witnessing like this kind of unprecedented security fragmentation of the security architecture in the region since the beginning of the century. And we mentioned all of kind of like the aspects, military competition, the growing political instability in some of the different key states in the region, the security flashpoints, especially in the Taiwan Strait, related especially to China's gray zone welfare operations, and the reshaping of security partnerships that is ongoing that we don't know yet what's going to happen. I don't foresee military conflict in the Taiwan Strait tomorrow or even in the next years or so. I think we must acknowledge the risk of a significant shift in the balance of power, especially if the US is actually weakening the networks of alliances, and the risks, therefore, of some changes, more like subtle in the Taiwan Strait, that could also happen in that kind of context. For Europe specifically, I think the immediate priority will remain the situation on the continent, both in the medium and short term. The key challenge, therefore, is to kind of like finding a balance and in our efforts to rearm Europe while also promoting peace and stability in East Asia, despite limited resources, as we mentioned, and limited political attention. Thank you.
Ines-san?
Sorry?
Thank you very much. It's for the next, for the last words after for Dr. Niquet also.
Well, I will be very brief, and it's very complicated to speak after Simon because he basically summed up very well, you know, what we can expect. I think one of the main point we must keep in mind, which is not very original, is that the situation is extremely fluid. And only after, you know, a few months, if we start in November, but 1-2 months after the nomination of Donald Trump, already questions are much more numerous than certainties. And this fluidity itself, of course, can lead to, as I've mentioned about China, you know, lessening the risk of direct crisis because of, you know, everybody being extremely prudent, but also that level of uncertainties can lead to a complete reorganization of the system of alliances, balance of power in the region in East Asia. And that also, of course, will have huge consequences. Another point, what we did not mention, but it would have consequences also for Asia, is what will happen between Russia and the United States. If there is really a rapprochement, we saw all these declarations, we remain to see what will become of them. But if there is a real rapprochement, strategic rapprochement between Russia and the United States, I'm not sure that there will be no influence on relations between Russia and China. It means that China will be even more interested maybe to rebuild partnerships with other actors in the region, if again it faces some worrying regarding its big northern neighbor. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for your last words, and last but not least, Professor Lee.
Okay, I'll have to end by mentioning about the domestic political situation in Korea, because as you can imagine, in Korea, we now don't have the luxury to think about foreign policy, because we're being consumed by the opposition party trying to impeach the president. It was actually supposed to be this week or maybe next week, the Constitutional Court will have a final verdict on whether the president gets impeached or not. And I mentioned that because depending on whether he gets impeached or not, is going to make a huge tidal implication for our foreign policy stance and our relationship with the United States or even Japan. I think you remember in those of you in Japan, what Korea-Japan relations was like under the previous government, Moon Jae-in government. It was the worst. Okay? Had it not been for the United States, probably our diplomatic relations would have been cut off. So that's another prospect, that's another possibility. If there's a impeachment and a new election, which has to take place within 60 days. So that's just 2 months. And we'll have a new president in such a case. And if that president happens to be, for example, the current opposition party president, Lee Jae-myung, or someone else from that party who tends to be very anti-US and pro-China and sympathetic towards North Korea. Imagine how things will work out with President Donald Trump. So that will throw even, Northeast Asian, the formula into a chaotic situation. So I don't even want to imagine that. So I'm hoping that the president comes back. And we'll see how that goes. Another very quick food for thought for you to think about is that because of all these talk about the ability of the allies to self-help and defend for your own, and I mentioned earlier about North Korea heading towards 200 plus nuclear warheads. Until when are we going to talk about denuclearizing North Korea? Okay, this is really almost a fantasy now. So I'm not saying that this is going to happen, but in Korea, if you see polls, surveys, over 70% of the Koreans surveyed want nuclear armament or at least latent nuclear capability to deter North Korea. So that's another, that's a huge question for non-proliferation regime, but it's not going to go away. And the more North Korea tests its nuclear weapons and fires its missiles, this issue will come back. This issue will grow and grow. Something to think about.
Thank you very much for this last thought about Korean domestic policies. I now leave the floor to Valerie, President of Sciences Po Alumni Japan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Niquet. Thank you very much, Dr. Lee, and thank you very much, Mr. Menet, for all your very insightful ideas about the situation here in East Asia. So this webinar is recorded. So I hope we can send it to you, to the three of you, and we will post it also on the social media for the alumni of Sciences Po. Really, thank you very much for your participation. Also, I would like to say a big thank you to Sciences Po alumni for the logistics support and the communication support. Let me say a few words about our private LinkedIn group. If you are a Sciences Po Alumni Japan or a student in Japan, a Sciences Po student in Japan, you can become a member of our private LinkedIn group. And here we put some job offers, practical information, and also our Sciences Po Alumni Japan information on conferences or networkings. So we are waiting for you. Thank you again, and see you, I hope, very soon with an online webinar.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Very much.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Merci beaucoup. 감사합니다.